Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 13, where we are going to be discussing normativity, subversions and queer identities. So just as a background to understanding these concepts, where we will be trying to unpack the idea of normativity. How is normativity understood in society? What is subversion? How do we understand subversion? And what is queer theory, and how does this theory help us to understand the various issues of identity politics that revolve around gender? So briefly, the background of queer theory, the background to understand normativity, subversion and queer theory is embedded in an understanding of feminist theory, in understanding of feminism, and how those sets of theories have influenced identity politics, and not just sociologically speaking, but we find the discussions around normativity, subversion, queer identity in socio-political and cultural theory. So it's quite an interdisciplinary, a very broad idea that is used across these disciplines, and here we will see how sociologically speaking we can offer some of the theoretical tools, some of the theoretical lenses to understand these concepts. So at the start of understanding normativity, the idea of normativity, particularly talking in the context of gender, we have the idea of heteronormativity, which is that the institutions, structures of understanding and practical orientation that make heterosexuality not only coherent, that is organized as a sexuality, but also privileged. So the idea of heteronormativity is premised on an understanding that institutionally speaking, in any given society, or in most societies across the world, institutionally speaking, the normative understanding, the norm is the heterosexual norm, and the structures of understanding that go with such norms, and how people orient themselves with respect to those norms, makes the idea of heterosexuality not just a coherent, not just a normative, not just an accepted fact, a norm in society, but as an organization of sexuality in society, which is also privileged. So we are also talking about a hierarchy here. We are also talking about a very subtle way of power negotiation that goes on with the idea of identity and sexual orientation. So that is one of the starting points to understand that heterosexuality is not only the accepted coherent form of gender structure in most societies, but it is also the privileged structure. It's also the privileged norm. So that is the starting point to talk about heteronormativity. So having that in mind, let us now try to understand one of the classic sociological concepts of deviance. So, what is deviant behavior? And this is going to be coming up again and again, as we talk about, normative gender relations, subversions from the norm or queer identity, that, how do we understand deviance in society, sociologically speaking. So, what is deviant behavior? So, we see that one of society's tasks is to coordinate actions of millions of people so that they fit together. These are the social norms. Individuals' actions are called deviant when those actions conflict with society's norms. So, very, very simply put, that all societies function on the basis of certain social norms, and these social norms are taken as indicators, as parameters to organize the society and also to coordinate various actions, various functions amongst the people who live in that society. So, these accepted forms, which are kind of regularized in the society, are called social norms. And any action or any individual who is deviating from this norm, that those actions are often labeled as deviant actions, and which come in conflict with the social norms of any given society. However, deviance is a relative concept. It's not, again, not an absolute concept. So, how do we understand that deviance is relative? Sociologists, in scholarship, we have seen that often emphasize that it is the society's reaction to the act rather than the act itself that makes something deviant. This is what is called the relativity of deviance. So, when something or somebody is deviating from the norm, that is not making it completely deviant. What is making it deviant is how is society reacting to that activity? How is society, positioning itself or positioning the person or the action or the behavior that is deviating from the norm. So, this is what makes deviance a relative concept, that it is the social reaction to the action that is making, giving a degree to the deviance. And we also have to be careful how do we understand deviant behavior versus crime in this respect, using the sociological lens, that deviant behavior is not a crime unless there is a law against that behavior. So, we have social norms in society and we have laws in society, and oftentimes what happens is many of the norms in society are not backed up by a law. So, society may have, the group of people residing in a society may have agreed amongst themselves about a particular social norm, and that need not have a legal premise or a legal backup. So, it is not, so deviant behavior is not a crime unless there is a law against that behavior. So, it is important for us to understand this degree of relationship or the difference between deviance and crime, deviant behavior and crime, because we have seen over time identity politics in that involves gender, that involves sexual orientation across societies, have gone through phases of legislation, have gone through phases of legal action or legal consequences or laws in that regard. So, this is one way to understand that when does a deviant behavior become a crime. So, how do we characterize deviance? So, we have seen that deviance can be relative. So, it is not until there is a social reaction to a deviant behavior that something is labeled as deviance. So, deviance is relative. Deviance is a neutral term, and what do we mean by that? That sociologists use the term deviance non-judgmentally to refer to any act to which people of a given society react negatively. To sociologists then, we are all deviants of one sort or the other because we all violate norms from time to time. So here, just to make it clear that deviance in sociology is used in a non-judgmental way, because any action, it refers to any action in which people of a given society would act negatively, oftentimes, if not most of the time, negatively. So, most human beings, as we have seen historically, as we see currently, most human beings deviate from some sort of a norm, every now and then. It is hardly, it's very difficult to find people who have stuck to or followed all sorts of social norms in any given society all the time. Of course, exceptions are there, but as human beings, we all deviate from one sort of the social norm or the other, and this is what makes the understanding of deviance as a non-judgmental neutral term, that any human being can do some sort of a deviant behavior at any given point of time, when there is a departure from the social norm and there is a social reaction to that behavior. So, this is what makes deviance a neutral term. And there is another concept that is associated with the idea of deviance is stigma. To be considered deviant, a person does not necessarily have to do anything. Sociologist Goffman in 1963 used the term stigma to refer to characteristics that discredit people. These may include violation of norms of appearance, as simple as that, like somebody has a huge nose, or somebody has huge ears, and the norms of ability, so blindness or deafness or etc. The stigma can become a person's master status, defining her or him as deviant. So, again, we all live in a society, any given society, where we function with social labels, and the way we label a person, the way we attach this signifying labels, these codes to another person, often can act as a stigma for that person. So, as Goffman pointed out, that to be considered a deviant, person does not necessarily have to do anything. So, just by the sheer attribute of appearance, people tend to label other people using certain labels, or by virtue of certain forms of ability. So, stigma in this case can become a person's master status, defining them as deviant. So, these are some of the important sociological ways of understanding how we understand deviant behavior in society, because that goes a long way for us to identify how we understand gender relations or gender identity or gender politics in society as norm versus as deviant. So, when we see that what are the various ways in which society functions in terms of departure from norms. So, if we can think of the norms along a continuum, and in this continuum we see that there are these certain components starting from folk way to social values or social mores, to taboo, to laws, to customs, and to fashion. So, there are various ways that norms can be adhered to, norms can be followed, and there are various ways in which norms can be deviated from. So, we have seen that most of the time that if a society or a group of people or an individual deviates from the norm in folk ways, in folklores, or in terms of social mores, social values, or deviates from taboo, it's kind of permissible in society. So society actually draws these boundaries around the norms, which are kind of flexible depending on the context. So we have seen that deviation from the norm along in folk way, in social more, in taboo is kind of permissible. Deviation from the norm in terms of customs, in terms of fashion, is also permissible to an extent, and we do see historical and contemporary references when people have followed or not followed certain customs, followed or not followed certain fashion trends. So we do see that there has been deviation from customs, fashion, etc. in society, and it's also permissible to an extent depending on the social composition. However, when somebody deviates from a norm that is a legal, that has a legal connotation, that is backed up by a law, that is backed up by a legal understanding, deviation from that becomes a criminal offense. So again, just to clarify that these are the various ways that a person in society can deviate or not deviate, and when does what type of or what degree of of deviation takes place, depending on from what have a person or a group of people deviated. There are two broad sociological perspectives to understand normativity, subversions, and deviance. The first perspective is the symbolic interactionist perspective, which is a perspective that sees individuals interpreting social life through symbols that we learn from groups to which we belong. So again, a very classic sociological perspective, where a group of people in any society have a shared understanding of a shared set of symbols in society, and we learn from groups to which we belong. So we follow these symbols in society, follow these clues, these cues in society, and we form we either have a group membership or we don't have a group membership, depending on that. And the second sociological perspective in this regard is the functionalist perspective, which is the one that sees all activities in the society as having a function. So this perspective talks about the presence or absence of normativity, of subversions, of deviance in society, each of them having a function. So each of them actually gives society some sort of a meaning, some sort of a dynamism through which social life can be measured, social change can be measured. So that is the functionalist perspective of understanding normativity, subversion, and deviance. So the symbolic interactionist perspective can be understood following three theories. So the first one is the differential association theory, which says that behavior that is conforming to deviant norms, and it was put forward by Edwin Sutherland, that something that is constantly conforming to deviant norms. It's the differential association theory. The control theory, or the next theory, talks about the desire to rebel is more akin to our natural behaviors, but certain forces prevent us from doing so. So control theory starts with an assumption that it is human behavior, it is intrinsic in human behavior to rebel or deviate from the norm. So control theory asks a very interesting question, that it doesn't really focus on why do we deviate from society's norms. That's a given that most human societies, most human beings in society deviate from the norm at some point of time. But control theory asks a different question. It asks, why do not we deviate more than we do? So it asks that when we deviate from a norm, what determines the degree to which we permit ourselves to deviate from that norm. So why do we not deviate from the norm than we usually do? So what is controlling, the deviation action? So what is the control factor here is what the control theory looks at. And the labeling theory looks at the significance of labels given to people, as I just talked about, such as names and reputation. So you often as human beings in society, give labels to certain people to describe them very quickly, or you signify these labels as having meanings. So this is the labeling theory that talks about how there's a shared sense of understanding in society, using the symbolic interactionist perspective. So you can see that each of these theoretical angles, whether it's differential association or control theory or labeling theory, can work very actively as a set of shared understanding, shared meanings, shared symbols in society to talk about deviance and norms. The second perspective, the functionalist perspective, talks from the vantage point of two theories again. So the strain theory of the functionalist perspective argues that deviance is necessary in society. It clarifies moral boundaries, affirms norms, promotes social unity, and brings about social change. So this is a very, very important function that deviance offers in society, that just by the sheer presence of deviance action, of deviance behavior in society, it informs or it sheds a very strong light on what are some of the social norms, social moral boundaries of a given society. So just by the practice or just by the presence of a deviance action, deviant action, the moral boundaries of the norms or the moral boundary gets brightened. So this is a very important function that deviance has in society, and it promotes social unity. So it brings together people who share the same sort of ideas or viewpoints about any particular behavior, and oftentimes it brings about social change. So the strain theory from a functionalist perspective has a very important role to play for the presence or absence of deviance in society. The illegitimate opportunity theory talks about crime is all around us, but different social classes have distinct styles of crime. So now we are talking about deviance as a crime. So a deviant action as a crime, which is again backed by law. So we see that it differs. The kind of deviant behavior differs according to social classes, as Clover and Olin pointed out, that we often see that the opportunities to make larger amounts of money is practiced by most social classes in any given society. And we see that the nature of these crimes, the nature of these deviant behavior, they shift from one social class to the other. For example, if you can think of such crimes related to a blue collar job or a white collar job. So these are socioeconomic classes which brings with them their own understanding of what is a deviant behavior particular to that given class, and the type of crime, the type of deviant behavior varies according to social classes. So these are two theories that come from the functional perspective to understand deviance in society. So now let's look at, in terms of gender, that what are the various ways that a person or an identity or a sexual orientation of a person can deviate from a social norm of any given society. So, going back to the lectures where we tried to unpack gender, unpack biological conditions, anatomical conditions of the human body influencing gender, pulling from that history, that part of the course, and coming to here, we see that in any given society, the existence of two compartmentalized biological sexes is probably impossible. And we do see that over time and space, that there have been expressions of gender, expressions of sexual orientation, and these are some of the examples that we see operative in any given society. So we have a category of transsexual, which is the gender sex incongruent, trapped in the wrong body but with the gender identity of their biological organs. So it's very difficult to again compartmentalize in one or the other box. Then we have the category of transvestites, where people prefer dressing as the other gender, or cross dressers as is popularly known in society. Then we have the categories of homosexual, the categories of bisexual, which is related to the affinity, the sexual orientation and affinity of a person in society. And then we have a category called eunuchs or castrated males in society. And finally, there is the category of the hermaphrodite who have both sets of biological organs. So you see that with the sociological understanding of deviance in society and understanding some of the theoretical premises that guide the understanding of deviance, we see that when we have the occurrence of these multiple categories of gender expression, of gender identity in society, then it is important or rather it is a necessity that sociological theory has a much challenging job to theorize the understanding of gender. So we see if we look at the cross-cultural perspectives of the third gender, that we have seen that classical anthropologist Clifford Geertz, actually 1975, said that human beings are divided without remainder into two biological sexes, male and female. So as you can see that this has been an ongoing struggle, an ongoing problem, issue with whether it's feminist scholars or anthropologists or sociologists or cultural studies scholars, or whoever wants to understand the relationship between biology and gender. Societies over time, human beings have been divided without a remainder into two clear biological sexes. So you either has to be A or you either have to be B. There is no remainder, and if you have a remainder, then most societies are perplexed, confused, or oftentimes do not have a space to fit in the remainder. So this comes from Geertz as early as 1975, and we see that across the world we have multiple expressions of the third gender, and here I have listed only a few of those examples. For examples, we have the Hanites of Oman, we have the Two Spirits of North America, we have the Aliha among the Mojave tribe, we have the Mahu of Tahiti of Polynesia, and we have the Hijras of South Asia. So we see that it is not an exclusive characteristic of any particular society, but this is a global phenomena. This is a trans-space, trans-time phenomena, and the very existence of such categories makes us even find it challenging to understand gender into two neat categories. So, one way of understanding this identity migration, or this cross identifications, or as some scholars have called the ambiguous identification, is to either recognize the identity difference from the biological identity assigned at birth, or deemed ambiguous in their anatomical identity at birth or later. So, we see that again, going back to the very simple example of when a baby is born in any given society, how is the baby identified, and the recognition of the identity different from the biological identity assigned at birth is something that we see coming out later on in life, not really at birth. But then the identity that is attached to a baby who is deemed ambiguous in their anatomical identity at birth or later, that is something that is a gender ascription that happens kind of at birth or later. So, coming to the first recognition, we see that there can be categories such as transvestites, transsexual and transgender, and each of the three categories are slightly different from each other, and we will see how in the next slide. And the one that is deemed ambiguous in their anatomical identity at birth or later are categorized as hermaphrodites or the intersex. So, as is apparent from this flow diagram, that the second one, that is the hermaphrodite intersex category, is a body problem, is an anatomical biological problem, and as society labels it. And the first three, the transvestite, transsexual and the transgender, are a mind problem. So, it is kind of an orientation issue that society looks at. So, if we have to focus on this the mind problem as is labeled in scholarship, that we see that transvestites is a temporary identity migration. There is no medical intervention for transvestites, and it is usually short term change. So, you see that there is a there's a preference or a necessity, or however you want to term it. There's often identity migration which is temporary, it is short term, and there is no medical intervention, surgical intervention that goes on in this case. The transsexual, that is the next category, involves bodily transformations hormonally and surgically, usually for a long term and may be permanent. So, again here we see that there is a hormonal transformation, and usually with a surgical intervention, a medical intervention, which is supposedly for long term if not permanent. And the final category, the transgender category, refers to adopting transformation of identity different from assigned anatomical identifying at birth. There is no medical intervention, and it is usually long term change. So, you see that it is a long term identity migration without medical intervention in usual cases, and the adoption of transformation of identity that is different from the one that is assigned at birth. So, now you see that these various categories or the various processes of gender have various implications in society, have various they have they work in society with or against any given social norms, and it is important therefore for us to understand what each of them refer to and how each of them are actually conceptualized. We also have an ongoing conversation in scholarship between the trans and the intersex. So, the trans identification, it is seen that they are more likely to embrace medical intervention, that maybe there is a need, or there is a want, or there is a preference for a medical intervention, and so they are more likely to embrace medical intervention. For the intersex, there is more likely to reject a medical intervention. So, this is what trends have found in research. So, the next difference that we see is between a trans versus an intersex. So, again it requires some clarification between these two terms. So, we see the trans identification, people who identify with the transsexual are more likely to embrace medical intervention. So, maybe there is a need, or there is a want, or there is a desire. So, it is more likely that people who identify with the idea of transsexual, they are more likely to embrace medical intervention. And people who identify with the category of intersex are more likely to reject medical intervention, as we have found in current research that has found out several trends. So, we see that the forms of identity transgression or identity migration that may threaten the very meaning of these terms. So, for example, I have used an example from one of the published works, that if a person who is deemed a man changes sex through use of medical interventions and through social presentation as a woman, then engages with intimate activity with another woman, then is this person now a lesbian? So, see, it can get quite complicated if we stick to the categories, if we stick to the normative or the classical categories going by the biological understanding, that we are, again, when we have, and these are conditions that happen in society. We see multiple examples of such behavior or options in society. And so, again, society is constantly trying to fit people again into either of the two boxes. So, it can get quite complicated. So, it is when we talk of gender identity, when we talk of gender processes or negotiation, it is very important to first acknowledge that it is an ongoing work in progress. It is a fluid concept, it is a process and not a static idea. So, we see some of these contested histories of transgender and transsexualism, where scholarship has given us some very important significant questions to deal with. So, is transsexualism a form of gender conformity, or is it some sort of transgressive politics that makes the fictional base of biological sex more apparent? So, how do we deal with the idea of transsexualism? Is it is it conforming to a particular gender type, or is it some sort of a transgressive politics that makes the idea that biological sex of a person is fictional when it comes to talking about the gender of a person? The second point here is, does transgender thinking represent the epitome of gender incoherence and disruption? And these are scholars who have been in the field for very, very long time working on gender identity, asking that is it representing the epitome of gender incoherence and disruption? And then is transgender the iconic gender outlaw? So, can we take the idea of the transgender as an iconic example of the gender outlaw? So, scholars such as Judith Butler, Nicole Foucault, we have seen they've constantly talked about gender identity politics from various significant angles, and some of these questions are reflective questions for you to understand how all of these pan out in society. So, if you can bring in the functionalist perspective in this regard and look at one of the categories that we have used as an example in a previous slide, and we talk of the category of hijras in the South Asian or the Indian context, we find very significant works done, including Serinananda's work on the hijras in South Asia. Please give Serinananda's work a read in this regard. And in her work, she has found out, or she has actually analyzed the functions as the hijras have in society, and where how can we bring in a functionalist perspective to understand their role in society. So we see one of the first important significant functions that hijras perform in South Asian societies is as cultural performers, and this is a very, very significant role that hijras perform, whether it's a birth of a child, preferably a male child, or during marriages. So that as cultural performers, their role cannot be ignored. The second function, and this is also very significant, is the audience, the hijras and their audience, and there's a whole lot of discourse and discursive power dynamic that go on in this respect, that how one relate to that that language politics, that that discursive power dynamic between the two. And the third important function that the hijras have in South Asian context is institutionalizing the idea of homosexuality. So by bringing in the idea of intimacy with men, so they have kind of institutionalized the idea of homosexuality in that societal context. And so if you're interested to read more about these functions, please read Serinananda's work on the hijras. Scholars have based on evidence have described in scholarship the several ways to describe the hijra category, and several times they have been referred to as neither man nor woman, and where has been the disjunctures in society with respect to these people. So we have seen that although hijras are culturally defined in terms of their traditional occupation as performers in auspicious occasions, many hijras do not earn their living in this manner. So it's not really a source of primary income for them, as we have seen through work. Although neither man nor woman, many experience their gender as women. So again, it's a gender identification that they have with regard to identifying as woman. And there's a widespread belief that they are born as hermaphrodite and taken away at birth. In reality, most hijras join their community voluntarily in their teens. So again, this is coming much from scholarly work that is published, that there's a common understanding that they are taken away at birth, but then what is seen that they join the community voluntarily around the time they are in their teens. So again, you see that these categories exist in society, and these categories can be as fluid as you can think they are, and they have social implications in society. And one of the major social implications, socio-political implications, is that if you look at the census form of India, the Census of India 2011, you will see that when a person is supposed to identify herself or himself or a person as male, female, and then there's a third category of the other, and this has been included in the Census of India in 2011 after a lot of political activism, particularly led by Lakshminarayan Tripathi, who has been at the forefront of transgender rights activists for a very long time. And India is one of the very few countries in the world currently which actually offers a third option for such a question. Usually it is you either have to tick male or female, but India is very one of the very few countries who currently offer the space, the recognition of a space beyond the two compartmentalized categories. And if you are interested, you can look up a resource called India Matters, a Judgment in Gender, to look up what went in the backdrop of making these three categories visible on a document as important as the Census of India historically. So so you see that these have major social and political repercussions, and we have seen that across the world, or rather here you see examples across South Asia, where you see that more and more the idea that gender can be fluid, the attention to the idea of the LGBTQ groups is becoming more and more visible as we see visibility, whether it's as a newsreader or as a college principal or as a contestant for a Rajya Sabha election. So just do some background research on each of these cases if you are interested to see how more and more of this is becoming visible. So with that, I now transition to talking about queer theory. So what is queer theory and where does all of this come from? So it is a field of gender studies that suggests one's gender and sexuality cannot be defined or categorized. The identity of any person is comprised of a variety of parts which makes every person an individual rather than a part of a group. So queer theory at this point comes in and says that just like sexuality, just like the biological sex cannot be categorized, it is also difficult to categorize a person's gender. So we have seen that queer theory emerged as a field of critical theory in the early 1990s out of the fields of the LGBT studies and the feminist studies. It explores and challenges the way in which heterosexuality is constructed as normal. So an idea that we started this lecture with, that it is not just normal, it is also privileged in society. The way in which the media has limited the representations of gay men and women. So media's role in the representation of people in terms of their gender identification is of enormous importance. The challenges, the idea of queer theory challenges the traditionally held assumptions that there is a binary divide between being gay and being heterosexual. So again, it is not just challenging the biological categories, it is also challenging the gender categories as we understand them to be, and it suggests the sexual identity is more fluid than is commonly understood. So in a nutshell, some of the major historical moves that have happened in this regard. The 1950s, in the Western world, the police actively enforced laws that prohibited sexual activities between men. We see the rise of the understanding of sexually abnormal and deviant behavior. In parts of Africa and Asia today, it continues to be unconstitutional. In 1977, we see the World Health Organization referring to homosexuality as a mental illness, which was removed in 1990. It's no longer taken as a mental illness. And we see that civil partnerships were made legal in the United Kingdom from 2004 onwards. So we see that societies have gone through changes, through reactions with regard to the gender categories. If we have to identify some of the similarities and differences between feminist theory and queer theory, we see that both sets of theories, feminisms and queer theory, they agree on having interest in unconventional gender characteristics. So, they do not profess that there is one or two or three only characteristics. So, and the interest in unconventional gender characteristics is seen for both. Both reject the concept of essentialism and binary oppositions in defining identity. So, both are conscious of the dangers of binary oppositions, and therefore, both reject that. So, queer theory in addition challenges the view of a binary oppositional divide between heterosexual and gay. So, the theory suggests there is a space outside the opposition which is defined as queer. So, again now we are getting into an idea of how a space is made queer. So, how an understanding of a space is made queer, and it rejects the idea, or rather it challenges the idea that even ideas of gay or heterosexual are binary. So, it challenges that idea. And we see that at the center of these debates we have seen Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, where they have both talked about identity categories as being instrumental in regulatory regimes, as Butler talked about, and Foucault talked about the postmodernist perspective of functionalism and the functions of identity or identification that we have in society. So, we see that over time there has been several landmarks in queer theory, starting from the work by Foucault that was published in 1976, The History of Sexuality, which talks not just about the emergence of sexual categories not as victims of power only, but also produced by power. And here we see that they are talked about as marginalized, but not outside the organization of society. So, again this forms an important idea that when we talk of a marginal community or marginal group, we have to also understand that the marginalized is not outside the organization of the society, and therefore it is as much a part of the production and negotiation of power. We see Judith Butler's very significant work published in 1990, Gender Trouble, and we see that more and more of this was becoming visible through documentaries such as Paris is Burning. If you are interested to take a look, please do that. It talks about the evolving drag culture in the Western world. And then we have the birth of Queer Nation organization founded in 1990 to cater to the understanding of queer identity. In the South Asian context and globally, we see the birth of a new type of cinema, which is the new queer cinema, and this is a space, again as I said, how we negotiate our space as queer. This is an independent film movement that started primarily in the US and around the 1990s, and these films had in common a central character that was in the margins of this society due to their sexuality, sexual orientation, and such cinemas addressed issues of race, gender, class, physical disability also. So, you see the birth of a new space as a queer space through the birth of cinema. And queer turned out from a term of abuse to appropriate positive form of identification. So, something that used to be used as a label for abuse gradually became integrated as a positive form of identification in society. And queer films, as we see, are a radical way to provide some sort of a message, a strong message to the mainstream, assumably heterosexual audience about the existence of a queer space. And in the South Asian context, we have the Bengali queer filmmaker Rituparno Ghosh. If you have not taken a look at his work, please do so. I strongly encourage you to do that, and please watch some of the films that he has made and try to understand how the production of a queer space actually goes on in his works. It is his works are heavily influenced by his own life experiences, and this is a very important way that a queer space is being created in Indian cinema. So to conclude with a question that, so is queer deviant? And we started with this concept at the start of the lecture, what is deviance. So we see that gender trouble, that is something that is proposed by Judith Butler, is evident everywhere in mainstream media. We see queer theorists suggesting that is evidence of a move towards increasing tolerance of sexual diversity, as we have seen in using the case of the cinema, the space of the cinema. Some others argue that these representations simply present alternatives to the norm of heterosexuality. So one way to look at it is to continue taking heterosexuality as the norm, and these are the departure or representation of alternatives of the norm. And oftentimes they are used for their shock value, not due to any desire to promote diversity, is something that some scholars argue, that what is the value attached to queer identity. And we see that the effects of queerness or queer space or queer theory on society has been quite significant. So Butler and the third wave of feminist movement brought in new directions in the use of language, and we have seen that how language can become a significant factor in a queer identity negotiation when we talked about the functions of the hijras in South Asia. Gender reassignment surgeries are increasingly covered by healthcare systems and insurance, and we see an increasing acceptance of unconventional gender and sexuality informing homosexual marriage rights and privileges of civil partnership in many parts of the world. So my question to you then, as we close this topic, is how do, with your understanding of normativity, subversions and queer identity, how do normative gender presumptions work to delimit processes and descriptions in society? Is power delimited and is it transformed? Is something that I want to leave you with to reflect on. If you are interested for further reading, take a look at Chris Beasley's Gender and Sexuality, Critical Theories, Critical Thinkers by Sage. And in the next lecture, we will be taking up the topic of representation of gender in culture and media. Thank you.